So a point that's often made is that some of the behaviors that people find so simple and natural and effortless are among those that are most challenging to model computationally. And Josh's work is notable for focusing precisely on those core behaviors. And he's interested not just in what humans learn, but also how humans learn. And he takes very seriously the data from empirical studies of human learners, including our very best learners, children. We haven't heard much about children today, but they are indeed the most amazing learners on the planet. For example, a child can learn a new word from just one or two examples and then generalize that appropriately. That's really an astonishing feat. And more generally, children are amazingly good at what we might think of as problems of induction, this philosophically entrenched, difficult problem of how we go beyond very sparse input to form broad generalizations. So children get input that is highly limited, highly noisy, and out of that they rapidly and easily acquire word meanings, they extract causal regularities, they detect hidden properties, they infer mental states, they acquire language, they build theories, to name just a few examples. So Josh and his team use top-down, probabilistic Bayesian methods to model these very learning processes. And this has been an incredibly productive approach with important implications for both human learning and machine learning. And just as an example, I noticed that one of his science papers that was published back around 2000 had over 10,000 cites, which is pretty amazing. Josh has won many awards for his work. I would be here all day if I listed them, so I just plucked out a few. He won the Distinguished Scientific Award for Early Career Contribution to Psychology from the American Psychological Association. He won the Howard Crosby Warren Medal from the Society of Experimental Psychology. He won the Troland Research Award from the National Academy of Sciences. And his Bayesian program learning research was featured as one of Scientific American's 10 world-changing ideas in 2016. So we're very fortunate today that he'll be talking to us about building machines that learn and think like people.
Okay, thank you for that amazing introduction. I was just remembering the last time I saw you speak, you were giving the best talk introduction I've ever seen, which was at SPP, but we can talk about that later. All right, and thanks to the organizers and to all the speakers for what's been a very stimulating day of discussions. I just want to start off by thanking a number of people, current students, either in our group or in collaborating groups at MIT, and also more generally, you might have seen on our affiliations there, the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines, which includes not just MIT, but Harvard, Rockefeller, a few other institutions, some alums, and a number of faculty colleagues. I won't have time to single out the individual contributions of most of these people, but for the key contributors, I'll mention them as we go along. All right, so excuse me if the talk has a little bit sort of a philosophy up front, because I think, given the different views that people have here, I thought I would front load some framework level ideas. So let's start with, if we want to explore our shared frontier of AI and cognitive science, let's start by reflecting on our shared history, and I'll do a fair amount of that. I think there are big questions that these fields have grown up together asking and trying to answer. Questions like, how can we characterize intelligence at all, in general, in computational terms? What kind of computer is the brain and the mind? If we think intelligence is some kind of computation, this is a machine, and what kind of machine is it? What insights can the scientific study of intelligence in the human mind and brain especially, but also other minds and brains, offer to engineering, and vice versa, what insights can engineering, building artificial minds offer to the cognitive sciences? And I'm an optimist about these things. I think there's a lot of common history that we should build on, and that will take us to much greater heights in the future. One slide I wanted to show, which is not a slide I think I've ever shown in a research talk, but I show this all the time in my introductory graduate course in cognitive science, MIT's 9012, just to trying to define, for the purposes of our class at least, what do we think of as cognitive science? And here's a definition. I certainly, this is just one thing you might say, but I found it helpful. We say this field, cognitive science, is the scientific study of the mind as a machine for guiding flexible, environment-dependent, goal-directed action. And that's a very general thesis about the nature and origins and use of human knowledge. And you can see different schools of cognitive science as different variations on that theme, many different variations. And it's important then also to look at the interaction. You'll see a lot of resonances, especially with Matt's talk, the last one, at the interaction between the organism and the environment, and to think about the ways in which our minds are adapted to the environment and maybe adapt environments to us over multiple time scales. The scale of biological evolution, cultural evolution, development, what we see mostly in children's learning, but it could last for decades, what we often call learning, and other kinds of much more online adaptation, say in perceptual and motor systems. And I believe there are general principles that operate across all of those scales and across both biological and artificial minds. So in that sense, I even agree with Rich, although there's a lot I disagree with him on. But I think it's important to highlight where, from my point of view, at least from just my personal perspective, I think, for example, the idea that there's simple, general, unifying principles that build minds from scratch really only operates at the level of biological evolution. So this is, for those of you who saw Rich Sutton's talk in the morning, in my response, this is what I was trying to say, not very well there. From my point of view, I think this is what Rich is talking about. At the same time, I think there's the levels that most working cognitive scientists and even most AI engineers operate are more these levels of adaptation. Mostly not even mostly the cultural level, although there are interesting ways to study that in the lab. It's not to say, and I agree also with Matt, I'm increasingly interested in biological evolution. That should be part of cognitive science. We should be studying it. We are kind of studying it, and I think it will be increasingly integrated with these other levels. But there's good reasons why our fields have focused on these levels that mostly go on inside individual organisms. They're the ones that most matter to us. They matter to us to understand ourselves, which is a lot of what this is about, or if we're going to actually build practical, augmented intelligence systems that interact with us in our actual lives, what we care about are things which can adapt to an environment on the timescale that matters for human life. Okay? They're also the most accessible empirically, and I mean that both scientifically and engineering point of view. I think to actually study biological evolution scientifically, it's amazing that you can study it at all, but you can't do controlled experiments. It's very hard, at least on any level of complex organisms. And similarly on the engineering side, we are, in the same way that deep learning and AI has been transformed by Moore's law and GPUs and accelerating computational resources, we're still several orders of magnitude at least away from the kind of computing resources to really study seriously the evolution of something like a human intelligence in machine systems. Although I'm optimistic that over some rather long time horizon, hopefully still in my life, we will be able to study those things. It's just right now it's not empirically accessible, biological evolution. But things like children's learning, or the learning in adults, or even the kinds of online adaptation that go on perception, those are empirically accessible. And I think when you study at these scales, it's not a bitter lesson in which the things that most psychologists and neuroscientists and even most AI researchers have been doing over the last few decades are wastes of time. On the contrary, I think there's lots of great insights to learn from the back and forth, and they point the way towards further and I think even more illuminating insights that can come in the future. So I'd like to talk about that. All right. Some of the things I think we've learned over the histories of these fields is that there are a few good ideas which have stood the test of time and proved their worth. And again, one place where I differ from at least, this is just a superficial, dumb misreading on my part, but the way I read some of the things that Rich was saying in the morning was that there was this sort of general arc from one kind of AI to another kind that does well, whereas for me, I see a number of good ideas that have had their periods of ups and downs and ups again and often downs again, and that what we learn when we look back at the history of really these fields going back to the 1950s is not that one idea used to work and now another one is right, but actually we can see from the ideas that have proved their worth, because they've risen and fallen and risen again as people figured out how to make things work that didn't work before, and even more how they figured out how the good ideas of one approach could integrate with the good ideas of another approach and get even better than either one on their own, that those are the most important lessons we learn. So certainly the recent history of deep learning and AI around neural networks is one of those good ideas. There's no question about that. And it's remarkable and inspiring to me that ideas which started with thinking about how a single visual cortical neuron, like in Hubel and Wiesel's work, when you take those and scale them up into many layers and wide layers, and you train them on big enough data, and you train them on data sets and fast enough computers, can transform, let's say, computer vision or speech recognition. And then even more, you can close the loop. Here in the upper right is a slide from my colleagues Jim DiCarlo and Dan Yeamans, who was a postdoc in Jim's lab at MIT, showing that these systems actually can give great accounts of what goes on in the parts of the brain, the ventral stream, the pathway that is largely thought to be where object recognition happens, that originally inspired this stuff back in the work of Hubel and Wiesel when they were studying the early layers of the ventral stream. And now it turns out you could go back and explain what neurons are doing, and Matt was showing something similar in prefrontal cortex. So of course we have to be inspired by that, and it's a great success story. But I'll tell you just two other ideas, and for me I see a lot of value in bringing these three ideas together. Neural networks, probabilistic inference. So when I was in grad school, that was just the beginning of that paradigm's most recent rise. And then in my early career, the work that Susan talked about, I played some role in that in the cognitive science side. But really, there's been huge progress across machine learning, AI, many areas of science and engineering, with systems, for example, Bayesian networks, like the system in the upper left there where you see the diseases and symptoms, machine systems that capture patterns of probabilistic inference on a very large scale, and even causal inference. So a directed graphical model like this Bayesian network, where you have nodes and arrows that represent, say, diseases and symptoms. And it's really important that the arrows go from diseases and symptoms because they have a causal interpretation. If for those of you who are non-experts, right, the biggest difference between a Bayesian network and a neural network is that in the analogous, quote, neural network, the arrows would usually go from the symptoms to the diseases, right? The arrows represent the flow of information, say from sense data to higher level cognition or action. But in a Bayesian network, they go in the direction of causality. And Bayes' rule allows you to turn those around and make inferences from data to say, well, if you have these patterns of symptoms, what diseases do you likely have? But it's really important to have causally structured knowledge so that when it comes time to act, you know what to do. You want to treat the disease and not the symptom. Of course, if you can't treat the disease, it's better to treat the symptom so that you can at least make people feel better. But if you have a choice between treating the underlying cause and just the superficial effects, we all know what we prefer. And that's just scratching the surface of the ways that these kinds of probabilistic causal inference tools have been central not only in cognitive science and neuroscience and AI, but in many other areas of, say, for example, biological sciences or physical sciences and engineering. And then there's a third idea. This is the idea of symbol manipulation. It's the oldest and it's the most important, absolutely. That's, I know, a kind of controversial idea because there's this narrative that says this is quote good old-fashioned AI, and this is how we used to think intelligence worked, and now we learn no, it's symbols that those are not robust. So you have to wire everything in, and rather it's better to strip out all the symbols and replace them with, say, for example, vector spaces. I think that is a fake narrative, and I think it's very important to say that. I think that if there's one best idea about how intelligence works as computation, it's the idea of symbolic languages for thinking, knowledge representation, and information processing. And I think you need look no further than deep learning to see that. Deep learning wouldn't exist as an engineering discipline without programming languages like TensorFlow or Torch or PyTorch. Those languages wouldn't have existed without previous generations of programming languages like, for example, Python, or C, or Lisp, and those languages would not have existed without previous kinds of symbolic languages like mathematics, calculus, or physics. Okay? There's a long history going back hundreds and even thousands of years. It's a history of cultural evolution, and somewhere back in biological evolution, some things changed in human brains. We don't know what, it's probably not very much, that allowed us to think symbolically in a way that no other species, no other organism, or intelligence that we know of in the universe can do. And that is essential to intelligence. So to me, what I think is that if we want to talk about a unifying science of intelligence, one of the key themes I'd like to put out here is trying to understand how these ideas of symbolic computation, probabilistic inference, neural networks, and all their various forms can weave together, as well as other ideas that I haven't had time to mention here. And you put all of these things together, and that's what gives us the kind of AI technologies that we have right now. Okay, deep learning gets a lot of the credit, and more generally machine learning, and that's as it should. Okay, because many of these systems which engage with complex sense data like images or speech work because of recent developments there. But they also work because of the programming languages and because of a broad framework of probabilistic inference that gives the loss functions for training these models. So I think we have to give credit to all those approaches. At the same time, I think we also have to recognize, and this is what motivates, I think, the future, is while we have all these AI technologies, we don't actually have any real AI yet. And what I mean by that is we have technologies which are systems, machine systems that do things that we used to think only humans could do, and they do them really well in some cases, like beating the world's best at Go. But none of these systems has the kind of flexible, general-purpose intelligence that I think each of us uses to learn these things for ourselves. Okay? Each of these systems has to be built by great teams of engineers at companies like DeepMind and Google and so on, and they just do that one thing, right? AlphaGo might beat the world's best at Go, and maybe with some additional, or as we've seen, with some additional innovations, it's the same kind of algorithm can be applied to chess. But neither of those systems can drive a car there. Neither of them can tell you what Go is or how Go is different from chess. Neither of them knows what a game is or can learn the words that a human, even a young child, uses to start to break into those systems. So I'd like to understand what's missing, what's the gap, and I think that that's a major open frontier, but one that is broadly shared between the science and engineering. So I want to try to show you a little bit about how we're trying to make progress on that. One other thing that I just think I have to talk a little bit about, it motivates a lot of the work we do and just makes contact with several of the previous speakers. So you've seen this figure basically a lot before about what was the first big success of deep reinforcement learning, DeepMind's system that plays all these Atari games. And I just want to dig a little bit into what's going on, basically just to show you some data behind some of the things that Matt was talking about. These issues of what machine learning people call sample complexity, which is like how fast do you learn, how much data do you need? Okay. And also looking a little bit into the different kinds of games that these systems do well at or don't do well at. Because it's just not right to say that, for example, the deep Q network learns all of these Atari games at human level. As you can see, if you look at that performance curve, there's a kind of a power law, where there's some games that it learns far better than humans, and many other games that it learns much worse than humans. The issue of data complexity here, again, that's about learning time. In the standard paradigm that's used in DeepRL and a lot of other people playing Atari games, the typical thing to do is to train these systems with about 1,000 hours of experience. Okay? 1,000 hours. That's like playing for almost 40 days nonstop if you had an 8-hour job. That's a lot of time. Okay, now what I want to do is show you a game that, first of all, you or any human can learn much more quickly than any of these systems. In fact, you're going to learn it just in a minute. And these are systems, this is a game, and it's representative of a number of games that are hard for deep reinforcement learning. So this is a game called Frostbite, and we've studied this and written a fair amount about it. I'm just going to show you a video of an expert human player playing this game. So let's watch this here. Okay, that's the first level. We can stop now. All right. And raise your hand if you've never seen this game before. Okay, most of you. Right. Anybody want to tell me how it works? What's the goal? How do you win? What's good to do? What's not good to do? Yeah.
I forgot exactly, but it's objects which are very important. You try to build some igloo or something, and there are fish involved.
Okay. Oh yeah, we lost the screen there. Yeah. Any other? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Don't land in what looks to be water
Mm.
and touch each of the rows at least once to change the color and then go back.
Yeah. So basically, yeah. I mean, you don't completely have it, but you mostly understand what's going on, right? Interestingly, you figured out a number of things to do. You figured out the end goal. You have to build that igloo. You also figured out some intermediate steps to do it, and you also both figured out things like don't do certain things. Though this player, it's not like you saw this player doing those things and failing or dying or losing points, right? You could just tell from what the player was doing that they were trying to do some things and trying to not have other things happen. Okay, that's real intelligence, and that's a lot more like the way humans learn to play video games. And it's the reason why you can learn to play a game like this much faster than DQN, or any current machine learning system, okay? So just to show some data, this is some data that we've collected in our lab from Pedro Cividis. He's the main student working on this, but it's also with Sam Gershman and others. So the sort of typical human level that a decent human game player can get at this game without extensive practice is shown on the top there. It's sort of call it that asymptote level of performance. It's a few thousand points. What you just saw, that player got a few hundred points. What you see on the bottom is the learning curve of DQN, which was the original deep RL system that played Atari games. And what you can see is that after 1,000 hours, it's barely learned anything at all. In fact, after 1,000 hours, it doesn't even get past the first screen. And a lot of that is because of, I think Matt Botvinnik was saying before, its exploration isn't nearly as sophisticated as a human would be playing this game. Or as you saw certain things watching a human expert, but you would quickly discover things like that from your own experience. Now, the human learning curve, if we plot it on the same scale, looks like this. It's nearly vertical. It's also important to say that there's been a lot of developments. I mean, it's amazing how fast the field of AI is changing. So DQN was published in 2015, but in the meantime, there have been innovations, a number of innovations. Now we do have systems that can, with enough experience, actually get to something close to human performance. So here's one, here's another, right? These systems are now getting close to human performance, and maybe they're only taking 500 hours instead of, or 300 hours instead of whatever humans do. Here's the best recent result that I've seen for this particular game, which can get close to human level in about 25 hours. But still, that's a big difference. Let's just zoom in on that to make the point. So here we're going to zoom in on the first 25 hours, and humans are still almost vertical on that time scale. But the optimization tightening approach, which is a really clever idea, it's still learning much more slowly. We can keep zooming in. Now we'll zoom in on the first 15 minutes. So we've zoomed in twice. And in the first 15 minutes, and now I'm breaking down human play from experimental data in our lab, showing like 3 quantiles. The top players, the top third of players, basically anybody like me who played some Atari or really any video game before as a kid, gets basically to that asymptotic level in about 15 minutes. The middle quantile, is about half as good, and there's a bottom quantile that doesn't make that much progress when they're just trying to figure it out for themselves. They don't figure out usually how to get past the first screen, or they just barely figure that out within 15 minutes. But that's still as good in 15 minutes as current machine learning systems get in many, many hours. And that's people who've never played a video game before, basically. Okay. And it's not, again, as Matt said, there's lots of ways in which we're comparing apples and oranges, and it's not a fair comparison, but that's the point. I'm interested in the difference between apples and oranges because I'd like to close that gap. Okay? But it's not simply a matter of the fact that, as Matt said, which is a really important point, that humans don't have to learn to see here, whereas DQN or all these systems do have to learn to see. That's true. But one way to see the difference is to see that in this game and many others, and I won't go through the details of this graph, but what this is carefully trying to show is that you can pick any point in the learning curve of, say, a machine learning system, at how many points is it getting in a typical episode, and compare humans at the same number of points and look at the rate of learning. And what you see is that humans are several orders of magnitude faster at each and every point. So it's not like they've just built up something and then they come into the game and they are learning at a similar rate but starting higher. And it's also, I think, a telling point that you can see all these things. You can see objects here and maybe even start to categorize them. But again, as anybody who's worked in deep learning and computer vision will tell you, these, at the pixel level, these games look very different from the real world. They're really simple, but they're really different. And as a result, systems that have been built to perceive objects in some form in, quote, real video, it's not, even if you've trained your system to see already, you can't expect that it's going to transfer here. And consistently, some of the failures of transfer in any machine vision system that's heavily data-driven, those are additional ways that point to the fact that there's something fundamentally missing. Okay, what's missing? Well, so here's my version of this meme that Matt was talking about, which I would say, I think it's still fair to say that current AI systems, and I don't mean to pick on deep learning or machine learning, what I mean is actually the current ways that we combine neural networks and symbolic languages and probabilistic inference, we're still spending most of our time working on pattern recognition and solving hard pattern recognition problems and taking other problems like playing Go or chess and turning them into pattern recognition problems. And it's really awesome and interesting that humans have figured out how to turn playing a game like chess or Go into a pattern recognition problem. But that's still what we've done, is turn it into a pattern recognition problem. Whereas intelligence is fundamentally different and more than that, in humans at least, and I think in other animals. And that's what I want to talk about and focus our attention going forward in terms of this shared frontier. So the contrast that I like to draw is the difference between recognizing patterns in data and modeling the world in all these ways, explaining and understanding what we see, imagining things that we could see but haven't yet, or maybe even things that nobody's ever seen, right? Making plans and solving problems to make those things real, and then learning as building new models, revising or maybe even constructing whole new models as we experience more about the world. So if you want to read about this at more than the bullet point or meme level, there's a very long, probably too long, but hopefully somewhat worth skimming through, BBS article by Brendan Lake and Sam Gershman and Tomer Ullman and myself, and a lot of commentary, including some very nice and illuminating commentary by Matt and the DeepMind group and a number of others. Okay. I would add, this is a slide I often show, and I felt it was important to add two other bullet points to this. There's many bullet points, but two that I hope maybe, they may come up a little in my talk, but more maybe in some of the panel discussion, because I think they make contact with important areas of psychology and philosophy that are well represented here and by some of the panelists. That are absolutely central to human intelligence. So the idea that we don't just build models of the world, but we model our own minds, and that's important for learning and thinking for ourselves. If we actually want machines that are going to be autonomous in the sense of self-governing, then they also have to have models of their own minds, I think. And we model each other's minds, and we share our models, and that's an important part of coordinating and with our behavior, cooperating, and learning things culturally that we've never directly experienced for ourselves. So if we want to understand human intelligence in computational terms or engineer things like that, we're going to need to understand all of these things. And I think it's fair to say that we're far from being able to do that, honestly, at least at the engineering scale that can be deployed at a place like Google or Silicon Valley or some hot startup. And we have to be honest about that. I think that if we try to compare different ideas at different stages of engineering maturity, that's not, and pit them against each other and say, what can you do here or what can you do there? That's not the most deeply scientific way to understand what are the best ideas going forward. As much as I believe a lot in the value of both science and engineering, and in our own work, we do that, okay? But I think we are beginning to make some progress, and I think we have a route. It's an old route and it has a long future, which is this idea that if we can reverse engineer intelligence in the mind and brain, that means do our science like engineers and understand scientifically what are the things that work in the human mind and brain that underlie these abilities, then that is a route to building these capacities in machines in the long term. Okay? So by reverse engineering, I mean doing science like an engineer, but I mean doing science. So at MIT, we have these larger entities right now. I mentioned the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines, and we recently started a big initiative called the Intelligence Quest, MIT IQ, but really just call it the Intelligence Quest. That's a better name. And it fundamentally embodies this idea, right, that the basic science of human intelligence and studying how it arises just more generally in biology and biological systems can lead to fundamental advances in the engineering of intelligence. And we can look at the shared history and see the value of that, right? So here I'm putting up, just in case you haven't seen these, some of you, the original papers underlying deep learning and reinforcement learning, including one of Rich's seminal papers. And Rich mentioned that he studied psychology. And the reason I want to put up these papers is to emphasize where and when and how they were published, right? These are papers that were published decades ago in the 60s, 70s, and 80s by psychologists or published in psychology journals. They might have been engineers or physicists or mathematicians, but they were doing psychology for the most part, or maybe computational neuroscience, right? Or general science journals like Nature. And this is true for single-layer perceptrons, multi-layer perceptrons, backprop, probabilistic neural networks, Boltzmann machines, the first kind of recurrent neural networks, it's really quite striking that what at the time were small steps, I would say small steps, but good small steps, to trying to reverse engineer basic kinds of learning in biology, when scaled up with engineering maturity, become transformative for the world. So think about what could happen if we could take the next small steps even, okay? And in particular, to think about, as Susan was saying, the actual best learners in the known universe, which is human children. So this is the work that I'm doing right now and most excited about. Here's a very nice glossy slide that our MIT Intelligence Quest people made for us, because it shows our quest, all right? It's a marketing material, but there's something important behind it, all right? The idea is, imagine if we could build machines that grow into intelligence the way a human being does, that start like a baby and learn like a child. I really think that that is something we can try to do, and it's something that if we did do it, we would have machine learning that really learns in a more fundamental way, and we'd have artificial intelligence systems that were actually, at least a step more intelligent, okay? This is work that is deeply informed, as much as anything, by empirical science, right? So you see me in this picture, but you also see two of my colleagues, Rebecca Sachs and Laura Schultz, who study the brains and minds of babies and young children. And there's one person, or there's a lot of people who are missing from the slide, but one key person who I've done a lot of work with recently and who's part of our broader team. She's not at MIT, so the MIT branding people didn't put her on here, but Elizabeth Spelke, who's a colleague and collaborator, in our Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines, and we've been working a lot together recently. And I think, and she's done as much as anyone to give a scientific understanding into the nature and origins of intelligence in the youngest babies' minds. Okay. So I think that by working together in small and much larger teams, and not just us, but a lot of people are interested in this idea. Again, I think there's a bunch of people at DeepMind and Facebook AI, people at Berkeley. Alison Gottmik, for instance, is very interested in this kind of idea. And I think it's a huge quest that we can work on. Okay, now it's also an old idea. It's not a new idea. It's probably the oldest good idea in AI. So famously, Alan Turing, in the same paper where he introduced the Turing test and the idea that intelligence was some kind of computation, he also articulated this was his best idea of how to build a machine that could pass the Turing test. It's a lot easier to put out the test than to solve it, right? We still haven't solved it. And as he said, well, maybe we could build a machine that starts like a child brain and that you teach the way you teach a child. How do we do that? Well, he didn't really know, okay? But he had some presumptions that he made. And I think what we're really getting at here, if we say, well, why didn't this work? Why didn't Turing, he died, he'd already died actually when this paper appeared. So there's a lot of reasons why Turing wasn't able to pursue this. But if this is such a good idea, you might ask, why hasn't this been pursued before? And again, it's because we have to grapple with some very serious, the hardest questions, and very much the questions that Matt talked about and ended his talk on, these issues of inductive bias, if you like. Like, we really have to say, what is the form and content of the starting state? How do babies' brains actually start? And how do children actually learn? Now, Turing could only presume, right? So here, I'm just highlighting the key part here. He said, presumably, the child brain is something like a notebook as one buys it from the stationers, rather little mechanism, and lots of blank sheets. Okay. And I think, this is the part of Rich's talk that really most animated me and to disagree. This idea, a different meme that says that this idea that we've learned from recent history that the less we build in, the better things work, suggests that in some sense AI researchers we should follow the same thing that you see Turing saying here, that the idea is that we should start with systems that ideally start with nothing. But if you actually look at the science, right, here's a paper of Liz Spelke's, you see a different picture, okay? I put up this paper, The Origins of Knowledge, because I think putting it next to Turing, these might be two of maybe the two most important papers on intelligence, okay? The ideas, there's the ideas in Spelke's paper, but also the empirical results, okay? So she showed that even in the youngest babies that you can study with the standard kind of methods that she and many others helped to pioneer, even 2-month-old babies, okay, whose vision is quite blurry and they can't pick anything up, let alone walk or talk, but yet they already have some kind of proto-concept of objects. And she showed that with a number of clever designs. A notion of object permanence, objects don't wink in and out of existence, But they're actually real things that you see the world not just in terms of high-level patterns and pixels, but actual physical things. Okay? They can go behind an occluder and you know they're still there. Recently, this is some work of Rebecca Sachs, studying the brain circuitry underlying high-level vision. In 6-month-old babies, she figured out some very clever ways to get good fMRI data from 6-month-olds, and now she's even gone down to 3-month-olds. And you see that the brain systems that cognitive neuroscientists have found underlie high-level vision, they're already there and functionally specific in important ways, even in the youngest babies that we're able to look at. Okay? They're also not as nearly as functionally specific as an adult, so there's definitely some tuning and learning, but there's also clearly a lot of genetically programmed structure in the brain. Maybe these are subtle nudges, as Matt was saying, but it's also quite possible that there's a lot of rich structure wired in, and we just don't know. This is an empirical matter, which the next years will hopefully give us insight into. And here's some work from Laura Schultz, who studies learning mechanisms, usually in older babies who can interact with the world and with other people, and in young children. Actually, this is work from her former student, Hyo Kwon, who's now a professor at Stanford. And again, they're showing ways in which not only is a child mind or a baby mind not just a bunch of blank sheets, but the mechanism of learning is not just something as passive as like copying down what you see on the blackboard, but active theory building and hypothesis testing. Okay? So I think, what we've learned is that Turing's presumptions, and again, he didn't claim there were anything other than presumptions, but we've learned maybe we shouldn't presume, and that there are deep lessons that come from studying both the initial state and the learning mechanisms, and that maybe these things are actually more sophisticated and have more to them than we might have thought. So I want to spend a little bit of time, which is most of what I should be talking about the work we do, trying to actually study these things, reverse engineer them in computational terms. So we've been focusing a lot in the last few years on what we call the common sense core, or what Spelke would call core cognition, and things like intuitive physics and intuitive psychology. So by intuitive physics, I mean what you see this baby doing here. This is a 1.5-year-old who's doing a popular infant or activity of stacking up cups. You can see he's built a stack of 3 cups, and he's trying to raise that up by building a stack of 2 more cups, which he's going to put together, and then eventually put on top of that other stack to make a stack of 5 cups. For those of you who work in robotics or who've studied robots, or have seen any videos of robots, you have to admit that this, if we could build robots that could do even this, that would be amazing. They can't do anything even remotely like that. So ask yourself, that's what I ask myself, and we study, what is the common sense understanding of physical objects in the world that lets babies do this? Or when we talk about intuitive psychology, so there's many studies I could point to, but one of my favorites is by Felix Warneken, who recently joined the faculty here at Michigan. Is Felix here by any chance? Okay. I think Felix's work, this is a younger version of Felix during his graduate days, and he's doing an experiment, but the subject of the experiment is the 1.5-year-old there who watches this weird action, and look how they come to understand it. So watch what that 1.5-year-old does. He steps, just watch, yeah. Okay. So, yeah, let's give a hand to that 1.5-year-old, and yes, exactly. So imagine if we could build robots that could do that without, you can hear some sound, I'm going to turn off the sound now, but without any true verbal communication, right, can watch an action that they've never seen before, get what the person is trying to do, and figure out how to help them. That would be amazing. And I think we don't have any AI systems that can do that, but we could. We're making some progress, little small steps, okay, towards reverse engineering these abilities. I'm going to show you them. But I think if we keep following that research program, we can have, for example, robots that could do that, and that will be the basis for building even more sophisticated AI systems, for example, that you could have a conversation with and that could help you out in those ways. Okay. These are also, you build on a lot of abilities that are not human specific. So here, focusing on intuitive physics, I'm just showing some famous videos from studies of New Caledonian crows, but also other primates like this orangutan, who's, if you watch long enough, will build a very interesting stack of big Legos, or in the lower right corner, the famous mouse versus cracker video. Here, I'll just, because we don't have too much time, you can see what the orangutan's doing. After quite a long time, he's built a very impressive thing. And this mouse, after struggling violently, he gives up, but then he goes back and gets the cracker and makes one last try, and there he succeeds. Yeah, he should get a hand too, but you don't have to, it's fine. Anyway, so I put this out here to say, look, there's an evolutionary history that we can't study, with controlled evolutionary experiments, but this is important because we can study their brains in ways we can't study babies' brains yet. And that gives us some hope that we might start to understand the neural circuitry, but also that evolution has actually built some stuff, either once or multiple times, but it's actually built some stuff into brains and minds that is that's understandable and that would be high value to understand, okay? So how do we do that? Well, in our lab, we've been developing some tools to do this, to build models of these kinds of abilities. And I'll tell you about a couple of the ideas that we have been working with. One is a set of new AI programming languages. I highlighted before the importance of programming languages for AI, like, for example, TensorFlow or Torch or PyTorch, right? And again, John Laird here can tell you this too, that in earlier days of AI, having languages like SOAR or ACTR, for example, were really important for people who wanted to build certain kinds of AI systems, all right? And that will continue to be true, I expect. The particular kinds of AI languages we work on are called probabilistic programming languages, and that really reflects something of their history, the same way that neural networks are called neural, but neurons play only a small part in neural networks. Similarly, probability played an important early role in the development of these probabilistic programming languages, but they're much more than that. Really, the best way to think of them is think of them as languages which allow you to combine the best of these ideas of different generations of AI research, right? So to have rich kinds of symbolic data structures and algorithms for capturing the sort of structured knowledge that, let's say, developmental psychologists have emphasized underlie children's intelligence. But also probabilistic inference for dealing with uncertainty and inference from sparse data and learning from few examples. Hierarchical models, it could be hierarchical Bayes or other kinds of hierarchies of, in some sense, probability distributions on probability distributions that let you do kinds of learning to learn or transfer learning, the kinds of things that Matt emphasized that he's starting to study in his group at the very end of his talk, like Harlow's learning sets. This is a place where the hierarchical probabilistic inference tools developed 10 to 15 years ago in machine learning and cognitive science are way ahead of anything that you can do with currently, even with neural networks, I think. Although the gap is closing in really interesting ways, and I think Matt was showing ways that these approaches might meet up in interesting ways. Okay. And also, of course, and increasingly, neural networks that get used for pattern recognition to really accelerate the kinds of inferences that you can do in these probabilistic programming languages. The one other important technical idea are what we call, or the slogan here, the meme, is the game engine in your head. So tools that have been developed for designing video games, for making a rich interactive experience. Like you saw Matt show some examples of an agent exploring like in a simple game engine environment. So tools that, like graphics engines, that let you quickly render the world from the player's perspective in real time as they move around. Or physics engines that let you do things like, for example, model what would happen if I were to tip this enough, you can see there's some water in here and the liquid should fall out, or if I were to drop it, how would it fall and hit the floor, okay? These are tools that are really valuable for building rich interactive experiences in games. And what we've shown is that if you wrap these tools inside one of these probabilistic programming languages, you can build very powerful tools for capturing these early common sense systems. That in some sense, I mean, again, this is a personal view and a crazy hypothesis. I'm sure it's wrong, but it might be a little bit interestingly right. That to a first approximation, something like these game engine tools are what's built into our brains through evolution. At the kind of things that, say, Rebecca is starting to see present in early brains in fMRI. Okay, so as an example of how we use this to capture intuitive physics, here we've studied extensively. This is work that was mostly done by Peter Battaglia and Jess Hamrick, who are both now at DeepMind, part of the same broad team that Matt runs, and pursuing interesting kinds of hybrids of this sort of approach I'm going to talk about and neural networks, which if there's time I might show you in a bit. But here, work we started doing a few years ago at MIT, where we showed that these probabilistic physics engines, basically, could capture people's intuitions about blocks world scenes, many different kinds of scenes. Like in these scenes here, the intuition that some of these towers are surely going to fall under gravity and others probably not. So what I'm showing you in that scatter plot is just a correlation between mean human judgments on the y-axis and a few samples in one of these probabilistic physics engines on the x-axis, showing just one of a number of experiments of how these tools allow us to capture with a pretty high quantitative accuracy people's intuitions about how likely the tower is to fall. But the very same thing can answer many other questions, okay? Really an infinite number of questions. We can pose queries in a query language, such as, which way will the blocks fall, if they're going to fall? Or how far will they fall? Or what happens if one color material is 10 times heavier than the other? That might change the direction for otherwise geometrically identical scenes if you just recolor the blocks. Or from scenes like these, where the blocks look like they should be falling, but they aren't. So it might lead you to posit that one color material is much heavier than the other. Which is it, red or yellow in each case? These are all cases that these models capture. Or I'll show you one example which we can do as an interactive demo, because it might give you the sense of how these models let you handle tasks which you've never done before unless you've seen this talk, basically. So here's a slightly weird task, but I'm going to give you this weird task to show how I can basically program your brain with a sentence, and now you can do a task that you've never done before with no learning. Okay. So imagine that I've bumped this table hard enough to knock some of the blocks onto the floor. Is it more likely to be red or yellow blocks? So you tell me, red or yellow? Okay. How about here? Here. Okay, you get the idea. I'll stop with that. But you can see, right, and those of you who are psychologists know this, but to the rest, we just did a great behavioral study. I mean, imprecise, but you can see from the blur of responses or the reaction time latencies, sometimes people were quicker, sometimes slower. We can see, in many ways, a lot of unanimity in the inferences you make, but also, in some cases, there's more or less uncertainty, right? Our models capture that very precisely, right? Not perfectly, but to a first approximation, we can account for most of the variance in what you judge and how confident your judgment is and how quickly you judge by just running a few simulations in one of these probabilistic physics engines. So what does that look like? Here's a simulation of a small bump of one of these tables, and here's a simulation of a big bump. And the important thing is that I didn't tell you whether there's a small bump or a big bump, and it doesn't matter. You could have done the small one or the big one. Basically, the same result would be true at the cognitive grain, right? Basically, though the fine details of what happens over that whole movie are different, you can tell that all of the yellow blocks are going to go and few or none of the red blocks. And you also only need to run those simulations for a few time steps, right? You don't need to run it to the end, and it doesn't even need to be a very precise simulation, okay? So approximate probabilistic simulation is the basis of these models that we build, and I think it's right now, it's our best computational model of this very basic early emerging intuitive physics ability. We also build models of what we call intuitive psychology, which build on these intuitive physics models, but now have a model of an agent. This is the picture you're seeing here. It's very much of the classic rational agent model that underlies a lot of the RL methods you saw before. But this is not a model of humans. This is a model of the human's model of other minds, or perhaps their own mind. But again, a probabilistic program whose inputs now are beliefs and desires and outputs are actions, and you see somebody's actions, which are operating subject to physics on a world state, and you want to work backwards to see, well, what do I think that person wanted or believed? Okay? And underlying the planning function here, just like what underlies a lot of modern RL methods or other AI methods, right, is some kind of maximizing expected utility idea. This is an idea that in developmental work with Julian Hara-Edinger and Laura Schultz and Hyo Wan and others, we've called the naive utility calculus. It's to distinguish it from the classical economics idea that says human action is governed by utility calculus. This is the naive or intuitive theory that even young children seem to have. Okay, now, because I'm running short on time, I'll skip some of the empirical studies that we've done, such as this food truck study with Chris Baker, but check out the Baker et al. Nature Human Behavior recent paper if you want to see a nice illustration of that, or DeepMind's, Matt's group's Machine Theory of Mind paper, which tries to tackle some similar kinds of things, but more from a neural network perspective. I'll just show you a scatter plot that says, again, this is actually even more quantitatively accurate, these models, of how people infer agents' beliefs and desires from how they move around in scenes, okay? And I think there's a good reason for that, both because humans are very predictable on long time scales in things like this, where they're trying to optimize their costs and rewards, and also because our brains are in some ways built through evolution and development and learning to be really good at those kinds of inferences. We can extend these models in a more of a vision and robotics setting. So this is work in progress, where we're actually taking, for example, the video of somebody reaching for things and trying to understand, well, what is she doing, right? So the same kinds of ideas can explain when you see this woman here reaching for one of a number of objects, which one does she want? Or in scenes like these, we might want to explain, for example, multi-agent action. So in this video here, what is it that makes the top scene here, sorry, that sort of cuts it off a little bit, but let's try this again. Okay. Why does that look like one person is helping, but on the bottom it's the opposite of helping? Again, watch the bottom scene. On the top, it looks like one person is reaching for something and somebody else is helping them. On the bottom, it looks like he's trying to get something and she's getting in the way or hindering him. So by recursively nesting these models, to have a model of two agents, where one agent can have an expected utility that's a function of their expectation of another agent's expected utility, we can explain something about what it means to help or to hinder, right? In some sense, it's similar to the insight in moral philosophy or many informal moral systems in many different cultures, golden rule type ideas that says, what is it to help someone or to be a good person? It's to basically take their utility function as your own. And we can build formal models of that, which are actually quite quantitatively precise models of what's going on here. We can even test these things in babies. So while I'm deeply inspired by the developmental work that I've referred to, it's only recently that we've been able to actually build quantitative models, for example, of infants' intuitive physics in scenes like these bouncing balls, where we can build quantitatively predictive models of infants' expectations about what objects are going to appear when from an occluded scene as a function of probabilities in one of these probabilistic physics engines. Or in some recent work that was really done in Liz Spelke's lab by the wonderful Sherry Liu, who's a grad student with Liz, and also Tomer Ullman, we studied the sort of naive utility calculus or goal inference in social inferences in 10-month-olds. So on the left was 12-month-olds in Luca Bonatti's lab, and on the right is 10-month-olds in Spelke's lab. And they saw scenes like the one you just saw there. Here, I'll replay it maybe with sound this time. Okay. The infants see that an agent has the opportunity to take a costly action to get to some goal and declines it, but then in another case has an action of the same cost and takes that action in this case. And 10-month-olds will interpret from this kind of scene that infants value the things that they're willing to pay costs for. And that cost could be jumping over a wall, it could be going up a ramp, if you look at the other stimuli, and it could be walls of different heights, ramps of different inclines, or gaps of different lengths. Those are all different costs. They're all physical costs, in which the cost is literally something like work done or force applied over a path. And infants seem to look at those scenes and be able to compute something about the costs, the relative costs and rewards, assuming that agents take efficient actions. That would license the inference that the more physical costs you're willing to pay, the more you value a certain goal. Working with Kylie Hamlin, one of the leading infant researchers studying morality and sort of pro-social cognition, these recursive utility models have also been used, not quantitatively, but qualitatively, to interpret and design new infant studies. Okay? So to me, this is part of that shared frontier. These are just scratching the surface of things. We can look in the brain, and since I'm short on time, I won't go into that, but it's another part of the shared frontier. They're related to the idea that even young infants have these capacities. We can study the brain systems underlying intuitive physics and intuitive psychology, and here I'm just highlighting work mostly done in my colleague Nancy Kamwischer's lab. We can also, it's part of the engagement with neural networks, we can also say, all right, well, what are the prospects for neural circuitry, whether it's in brains or machines like the kind that DeepMind is building, for being able to make these same kinds of inferences? Could we, for example, build a neural physics engine? Okay? Because if there's a physics engine in the brain, as Nancy and Jason Fisher and others seem to have found, then it's got to work in neurons, right? Or if DeepMind is building neural network-based AI, how are they going to handle these things, right? And here's a place where, again, I can just highlight a point that we can come back to in discussion if people are interested in. But as an example of inductive bias, as an example of not trying to follow the idea that says build in as little as possible, but actually trying to figure out scientifically what seems to be built in. through the combination of the study of infants' brains and minds, as I've already pointed to, and a lot of recent engineering efforts, some done in our group. For example, these slides come from Michael Chang, who was a master's student in our group and is now a PhD student at Berkeley. Some done at DeepMind, some done at Facebook AI, some done at Berkeley also, some done in Jürgen Schmidhuber's group in Switzerland. A lot of people recently have been basically trying to model these balls bouncing in a box. And what they found is that early attempts, as I'm showing here, which try to model intuitive physics without having some notion of objects, don't work very well. They can work okay with lots of training data, but they don't generalize very well at all. On the other hand, this work here, these are the efforts I was just referring to. If you build in some kind of proto-notion of objects, okay, and that's a symbolic notion. You have multiple objects that are individually tracked with symbolic data structures in your code. And also interactions between objects, so graphs of objects. And again, this is very much what Matt was, it's the same kind of ideas behind what Matt was talking about in how they were building more object-sensitive language visual parsing things at the end of his talk. These ideas that build in some notion of object in various ways and then use neural networks to learn the way force interactions work between objects, they work much better. They learn from less data and they generalize much better. So that doesn't mean that objects have to be built in, but it's compelling empirical evidence that this is something that you might want to build in. And again, that's inspired by actually the neuroscience and cognitive science underlying that. There's all sorts of other ways that people in our group and others are exploring the interaction of neural networks for pattern recognition in intuitive physics with basically more object-based, symbolic, game-style physics engines. But I don't really have time to tell you those. It's just an active area of exciting research. The last thing I just want to leave you with is a couple of minutes on learning. Okay, hopefully I've given you some reason to think that we have some hope of capturing these basic common sensibilities, for example, of intuitive physics with something like a physics simulation program. Okay, but if so, then I've made some point that I've argued that some part of those is genetically programmed or built in. There's some role for nature, but there's clearly a big role for nurture, right? Clearly, I mean, here I'm pointing to the work of René Bayer-Jean and many other colleagues studying empirically how the intuitive physics of babies develops, and it develops a lot over the first few months, and there's very interesting research there. I would take with a grain of salt any specific numbers I put up on here, both because I'm roughly summarizing a rich and complex literature, and also, the reproducibility kind of data sampling crisis in psychology unfortunately hits infant studies pretty hard, and I think we are in the process of getting a lot more data that will hopefully pin down these ages of development much more than we've been able to do. So I think a lot of this will change. But the idea that there's development in intuitive physics over the first year of life, at the same time as there seem to be important things built in, that's absolutely, that's our best science says that's likely to be true. Okay? So that raises a hard problem of learning. Can we build systems that learn, that might, for example, explain these different stages as something like different stages in an intuitive physics engine? And that's a hard problem of learning, so much that we call it the hard problem of learning, or a hard problem, by which I'm contrasting it with learning in, say, a deep neural network or any end-to-end differentiable system, where what makes that such an attractive way to do learning is that you have a cost function, and you can formulate a smooth optimization landscape where learning is basically just rolling downhill. So stochastic gradient descent, that's basically what it does, right? Very reliable, okay? The problem is that if you want to learn something like a program, like a physics engine program, then we don't know how to do that yet, okay? And the progress we've made on neural physics engines takes a step in that direction, but still we're faced with very hard kinds of structure learning problems, we think, at least with our current best understanding of what physics programs look like, such that the optimization landscape, there's no nice topology or geometry, okay? Yet somehow children are able to solve these problems, okay? So this hard search problem. In developmental psychology, as I mentioned this a little bit before when I mentioned Laura Schultz and Hyo Wan's work, okay? But much more broadly, this idea that's sometimes called the child as scientist is an idea that Henry Wellman and Susan Gelman and others at Michigan have really been some of the key contributors to, or Susan Carey at Harvard. This idea that, again, children are actively forming hypotheses and testing them and doing experiments. That's one way to characterize how children solve these hard search problems. And I just want to point to some of what I think is the next frontier here on the computational side, the more algorithmic complement to the child as scientist. Is what we like to call the child as coder. The idea that if what you learn, what you're building are these complex programming systems, then learning has to be something like programming, only programming your own mind. And I look at, and for those of you who do coding in your active life, right, think about all the ways that you try to make your models better. What do you do on a daily basis when you're coding? Basically, you're somehow trying to make your code more awesome. It could be more accurate. I mean awesome to be a particularly vague but term we all know, right? What does it mean to make awesome code? It could be fast, it could be accurate, it could be elegant, it could be generalizable and transportable. They're all different ways, okay? And I think children's learning should be seen as having similar broad motivations. Similarly, think of all the ways that you try to tune or try to improve your code. It could be tuning parameters like gradient descent does, but it could be debugging or writing new functions or writing whole new libraries of functions or importing over some functions that you wrote for another purpose but now for this purpose, or some functions that somebody else gave you or that you went out and got, or refactoring your code, which means basically rewriting a library in different kinds of terms to be more efficient, elegant, or hopefully generalizable, or writing whole new languages. All of these activities of of coding, I think, have analogs in children's learning. And if we want systems that learn like children, that learn something like these common sense simulation programs, they're going to have to do these things, these activities for themselves. So in work that we've done in our group recently, our work on learning has focused on basically program learning programs. So we had some work a couple of years ago, this was Brendan Lake's thesis, which got a lot of attention in the press. It came out in Science at a time of the first big wave of interest in AI, and I think the work is great work that Brendan did, but its attention in the press was just more than anything about the moment. And so for those of you who've seen, I'm not going to go into it here, but we were studying how to do one-shot learning of new characters in new alphabets, what we call the omniglot data set. And we built a machine system that, inspired broadly by how children, as Susan mentioned, learn new concepts from single examples, that can say, look at a new character and infer a program, a probabilistic program that can generate that character, capture the variability, and then be able to generate new instances. We didn't do this because we wanted to solve character recognition any more than Jan LeCun studied MNIST because he wanted to solve character recognition. It was just a test bed to develop this idea of learning to learn compositional causal models from one example. And the system worked really well. It passed a kind of Turing test. So the way we showed that was we show people one instance of a new character, a simple visual concept, and ask them to make up another instance, not to copy it, but to make up another instance. And our machine could do the same thing in a way you can't tell. Can you tell which is the machine or the humans? Here's the answer. Probably you couldn't tell, okay? Now, we put this out there partly as a challenge for other kinds of learning approaches, including deep learning systems. And here's a nice example of some work from DeepMind, as well as some recent work from our group, trying to tackle this, trying to build systems that learn with less prior knowledge. Our system had a lot of prior knowledge built into it, okay? And you could say, well, suppose we try to strip out that prior knowledge. Can we still learn to solve this task? And there's been some exciting progress. But I'm happy to talk about this later, but we're still far from being able to do that. These systems still, if you look closely, they make a number of mistakes. Like they don't come anywhere close to passing a Turing test on any close inspection. And we think that's because they're not yet sufficiently compositional and causal. So this is just the same message I think you're getting from Matt. Matt said these systems actually do have a little bit of compositionality, and I'm saying, yeah, but they don't have enough. Okay. But by working together, we can try to address this, I think. We can do the same kind of thing in Atari. So in some work that actually DeepMind has helped to fund, Pedro's been building systems that can actually start to, in a similar way, kind of learn simple game engine programs to come close to actual human-level learning in simple video games. Or we've also been working on Clever. And again, this is a domain, this is the same thing that Matt ended with. It's also a domain whereby basically combining neural methods for going from a visual scene to some kind of symbolic, or a visual image to a symbolic description, and also neural methods that can go from a sequence of words to something like a symbolic parse. And you can put those all together on an underlying shared symbolic reasoning substrate where the neural networks just parse from the sense data into that symbolic reasoning. You can get much better sample complexity and much better generalization. This is work from Kei-Shin Yi and Jiajun Wu and others at MIT. Okay. So will this scale up to all the activities that a human child learns in the course of their daily life over the first decade of life? Probably not. But I hope these ideas that I've shown you, these ideas of knowledge as programs and learning as coding, might be the next small step. And as a preview to work that's coming next, I think this idea of learning as coding, I mean, I'm just pointing to some recent work we've been doing of what we call wake-sleep program learning. But the area of the interface of learning and coding is a huge new breakthrough area that you're going to see in both AI and cognitive science. So just to wrap up, okay, I see I've gone a little bit over, and I'm sorry for that at the end of a long day, but thanks for your patience. I think it's just very important to, if we're talking about a shared frontier, to really do the best that we can to say what that looks like from a serious scientific perspective. So I've tried to do both some of the engineering and the science, and to show you some of the ways that cognitive science gives us insights, important insights. We don't want to throw them out. We want to develop them and understand them better for what is the stuff that makes human intelligence, the particular aspects of model building I talked about, and what are some of the ways that we combine some of the best tools from multiple schools of AI. And then we come to these questions of what is the inductive bias, what is built in, and what are the learning mechanisms. And again, I think that that actually the message, the history shows us not that we should start with as little as possible, but rather that if we try to work hard to try to figure out what are the actual minimal things that might be built in, and then what are the learning mechanisms that can extend those, that I think that might be the basis for some exciting next steps. Thanks.
Before we start our panel presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
Hello. A number of people have mentioned this idea of what's built in. Hi, over here. From the point of view of neurobiology, the thing that I would think would be built in would be the sort of initial connectivity of the brain and the dynamics of the different neuron types in it, and the processes for changing synapses. But I didn't hear you or any of the other speakers really address, how would you incorporate that kind of sort of built-in in your models of how development might proceed?
You mean you're saying how would we incorporate that, say, into neural network learning algorithms?
Yes, exactly.
Well, I think Matt that's a lot. I mean, I'll let Matt speak. Are we going to have a joint panel discussion with all the speakers, or just discuss? Okay, so maybe that's something to come back to with the other speakers, but I think that's partly what Matt was gesturing towards. And, we were, like, in the neural physics engines that I put up there, those also, you can say, basically, at some level, you could look at them and see a bunch of connections, right? Or you could actually look at them and see, oh, there's actually symbolic architecture that's built in certain ways, which routes certain kinds of patterns of connectivity, the same way that when you take a deep convolutional neural network, there you also have built in certain architectural motifs of convolution, which you can think of as ways of, building in biases of the kinds of, synaptic connections that are going to develop through experience.
Thanks, great talk. And I just wonder, like several works of the different scenarios of knowledge has been applied in your works. I just wonder, is there any researches have been conducted in which kind of prior knowledge we can choose in different scenarios?
I'm not. I'm not sure exactly what you were saying, but you're making a link between different kinds of symbolic representations of different kinds of prior knowledge, and how do you choose? Yeah. Well, that's one way. I mean, in some of the earlier work that I did about 10 years ago with Charles Kemp, we built models like that where we said different kinds of symbolic structures could capture high-level domain knowledge for different domains. Like, how do we know that, say, like natural kind biological species should be organized into something like a tree structure, but color space has a different structure, or face space has a different dimensional structure. I'm not sure if that's what you're getting. I mean, that's one way to approach the problem, is to have some kind of different sorts of symbolic motifs that you can do that the child's mind could do inference on to try to figure out what's the structure of this domain or what's the structure of that domain. It was inspired actually very much by, say, Susan Gelman's ideas and Henry Wellman's ideas about how children initially carve out different domains of cognition with different organizing framework principles. I think right now that we stopped doing that because at the time the tools we had were not able to capture the kind of organizing principles that really undergird the real domains that children capture, the interesting reasoning domains like intuitive physics, intuitive psychology, or all the different causal mechanisms in intuitive biology. But where the new tools that we've been developing here, these ideas of learning programs and learning even whole programming languages, I think now it's time to go back to that, and in some new work that students in our group are doing, it's about exactly that, to try to capture how when a child learns a new domain theory, that you can think of it as like a domain-specific programming language, basically. And that gets at issues of conceptual change that I think have been some of the most interesting challenges that developmental psychologists have raised and that computational models are maybe now in a position to grapple with.
I think we should thank Josh.